Good evening, everyone. Today I'm going to present about the history of civil rights movement. My presentation today entitled "The Timeline of American Civil Rights Movement." So, several years ago, exactly in 2020, there was a social movement carried out through social media called Black Lives Matter, where the movement was triggered by the brutal action of the police when they arrested a black man named George Floyd, which causing him to die. The Black Lives Matters movement aims to fight police brutality against black people. Actually, this movement has been conducted since 2013, where they also protested the police brutality against black people. The social media movement, Black Lives Matters, is actually a manifestation of the sustainability of the social movement, civil rights movement, because both of them have the same spirit, namely fighting for black rights. However, today we will not talk about Black Lives Matters, but we will talk about the civil rights movement. I've prepared some guiding questions as the topic of our discussion today. Some of our guiding questions are this. The first one is, what is civil rights movement, and then how did it happen, and then the third, who are the famous figures of the movement, and then the number four, what is the results of civil rights movement, and then how does it affect today's society, and the last one is conclusion. So then we will move to the first question first. So the first question is, what is civil rights movement? So civil rights movement is a social movement which consisted of series of events that fights for social justice for black people in the United States. The social movement emerged and became nationally famous in the United States during the 1950s and 1960s, because during this period of time, people consistently challenged the racial segregations and discriminations that existed in society at that time. Protesters demanded that black Americans have the same rights as whites under the law in the United States. The movement emerged because even after the Civil War ended and the practice of slavery in the United States was officially abolished, the practice of discrimination against black people still continued. Therefore, black people must continue to bear the brunt of the racism that occurs, which discriminations often occurs in the South. In the South, many organizations, most notably the Southern Christian Leadership Conference (SCLC), led by Martin Luther King Jr., the Congress of Racial Equality or CORE, and the Student Nonviolence Coordinate Committee or SNCC, conducted nonviolence demonstration to attract the attentions of the entire populations of the United States, included white people, to open their eyes widely and see the inequalities that occurs in their daily lives. In the end, the civil rights movements achieved their goals and it pushed for the passage of an equal rights law. However, this is not a complete guarantee because there are still various groups that suppress black people economically and socially in the following years. These problems make it difficult for the idea of real equality of rights to be fully realized into the 21st century. And then the next question will be about how did it happen? So there are several events that I prepared here, and I think that the following events are important events that led the civil rights movement to its success. Some of the events that I think are important are: the first one is Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, and then the second one is Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott 1955, and then the number three, the Little Rock Nine and the Little Rock Central High School integration in 1957, and then number four is Birmingham demonstrations in 1963. Number five, March on Washington in 1963, and then the last one is Civil Rights Act in 1964. Then we will discuss those important events one by one in more detail so that we can understand every details of the occurrence of those events. So the first events that we will discuss is uh, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. On May 17 in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka that racial segregation in public schools was cancelled and became unconstitutional, so that racial segregations in socials and schools became like illegal. The decisions also effectively overturned the spirit but equal decisions of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, who had authorized the Jim Crow laws, mandating that public facilities be separated from for whites and African Americans and should be implemented throughout the South. Meanwhile, the results of Brown's ruling only applied to schools, which implied that segregation in other public facilities should also be unconstitutional. And then the second event that we will discuss is Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. On December on December 1st in 1955, a 42 years old African American who is civil rights activist named Rosa Parks found a seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. The Segregation Act at that time stated that black passengers had to sit in designated designated seats at the back of the bus, and Parks had complied. But later, when a white man got on the bus and couldn't find a seat in the white sections at the front of the bus, the bus driver instructed Parks and three other black passengers to give up their seats. But she refused to give up her seat to the white man, and as a consequence of that action, she was arrested. Her arrest sparked outrage and support from other black people, and it initiated the ongoing bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, which led by Baptist pastor Martin Luther King Jr. where it was a role that would put him in front and center of the struggle for civil rights. The protest was really successful, that it was extended indefinitely. In the months that followed, protesters faced threats, arrest, and fired from their jobs. However, the boycott continued for more than a year, which eventually led to the Supreme Court ruling that the segregation of seats was unconstitutional and illegal. So there was no practice of segregation of seats anymore. And then the next events is the Little Rock 9 and Little Rock Central High School integration in 1957. After the United States Supreme Court ruled that the policy of separating black and white schools was abolished in the Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas asked volunteer students from all black high schools to attend the school there as part of the policy that schools were no longer segregated. Then on September 3, 1957, nine black students, known as the Little Rock Nine, arrived at the school to begin their first class, but were instead met by the Arkansas National Guards, uh, which on the order of Governor Orval Faubus, and a mob who shouted and threatened them. They tried again of They tried again a few weeks later and managed to get in, but had to be moved for their safety when violence broke out. Finally, President Dwight D. Eisenhower stepped in and ordered federal troops to escort the nine of them to and from their school's classes. However, however, students still faced harassment and prejudice directed against them. This case attracted the attention of many people and sparked protests. And then the next case is Birmingham demonstration in 1963. In the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. and SCLC, together with the local pastor Fred Shuttleworth and Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, uh, ICMHR, launched launched a campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, aimed to undermine the city's long-standing system of racial segregation. Their campaign began on April 3 in 1963 with sit-ins, an economic boycott, mass protests, and a march at City Hall. The demonstration faced oppositions from many quarters, such as an indifferent and apathetic African American community to the issues, hostile white and African American leaders, and a hostile public safety commissioner, Eugene Bull Garner. In that movement, Martin Luther King Jr. arrested for violating against a protest order and placed in solitary confinement. The demonstrations continued, but after a month without concessions, King was convinced to launch a protest movement they called as the Children's Crusade. On May 2nd, in 1963, volunteers who were school-age students skipped a school and began marching to protest. Many of them did not resist when they were arrested and imprisoned. On May 3, Corner ordered police and firefighters to install high pressure water hoses and attacked the children by spraying them with high pressure water. However, the violent tactics against the powerful demonstrators caused outrage in the community, which led to it gaining national attention. The media pushed President John F. Kennedy to propose civil rights legislation on June 11. Although the Birmingham campaign ultimately yielded something significant, tensions remained high in the city, and the gathering places of the civil rights activists were constantly threatened until a bomb exploded at 60th Street Baptist Church on September 15, which killing four African American girls and injured many others. And then the next event is March on Washington in 1963. In 1963, the demonstrations culminated with the March of Washington for Jobs and Freedom on August 28 to protest civil rights abuses and jobs discrimination. A crowd of about 250,000 people gathered peacefully on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. to hear speeches by civil rights leaders, most notably Martin Luther King Jr. He addressed the crowd with an eloquent and uplifting message that came to be known as the "I Have a Dream" speech. And then the last events that I considered as important is Civil Rights Act in 1964. On July 2nd, in 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act to become law, which is stronger versions of what President Kennedy had proposed the previous summer before his November 1963 assassination. It authorized the federal government to prevent uh, racial discrimination in employment, voting, and use of the public facilities. Although controversial, the law was a triumph for the civil rights movement, which was one of their goals. Okay, then after discussing several events that are included in the series of events in the civil rights movement, now I will discuss some of the famous figures of the movement. So, the guiding question is who are the famous figures of the movement? So, the famous figures of the movement that we want to discuss are Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. I choose these two figures because they both have different style in conducting their movement, in which Martin Luther King Jr. more use of non-violence movement, while Malcolm X used violence movement. So the first one is Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. Was a social activist and Baptist minister who played a key role in the American civil rights movement from the mid to 1950s until his assassination in 1968. He led a movement to seek and fight for equality and human rights for disadvantaged African Americans, which is uh, economically unwell and fall victim to the injustice of the system through peaceful protest. He was the main actor behind important events such as the Montgomery bus boycott and March March 1963 in Washington, where all these movements brought the changes in the social system in the United States, marked by the passing of important laws such as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 and is remembered annually on Martin Luther King Jr.'s Day as a U.S. federal holiday since 1986. And then the second figure is Malcolm X. Malcolm X is one of the African American activists who are fighting for freedom and black rights. But the way he did it was very different from Martin Luther King Jr., where he used more radical and violent movement to fight for his goals. However, toward the end of his life, Malcolm X publicly stated that Dr. King wanted the same thing I wanted, freedom. But for most of his ministry, he did not identify with the king and the civil rights movement. While Black Muslim and King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference share the same general goals of defeating white racism and empowering African Americans, Malcolm and King have distinct tendencies to speak in different places, which is street corners versus churches, and have different goals. Malcolm, who would openly deny that he is American, works for the nations of Islam, which seek to create a spirit society for its members. Malcolm rejected integration with white America as a worthy cause and mocking it as coffee with biscuits, and particularly opposed nonviolence as a means to achieve it. He said, "That's what you mean by nonviolence, powerless." In Malcolm's mind, African Americans could never give up the rights to defend themselves against white violence. Okay, then we will move to the next guiding questions. So the next guiding questions is, what is the results of civil rights movements? So I identified there is two results of the civil rights movements, which are Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the first one, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed with the aim of ending segregation in public places and prohibiting employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, which is considered one of the highest legislative achievements of the civil rights movement. It was first proposed by President John F. Kennedy and survived strong oppositions from certain members of the Congress, and was later signed into law by Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson. In the following years, Congress expanded the act and passed additional civil rights laws such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then the second one is Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, aimed to overcome legal barriers at the state and local level that prevented African Americans from exercising their rights to vote as guaranteed under the 50th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Voting Rights Act is considered one of the most far-reaching civil rights laws in the U.S. history. And then we will move to the next question, which is, how does it affect today's society? So according to me, so basically this is in my opinion, the civil rights movement greatly influenced various aspects of social life in the United States, especially for black people there. Black people have a better life than their parents or grandparents in the past, partly because of the civil rights movement. The movement indirectly provides the legal basis that regulates and ensures the security of black people from racial discrimination so that they can more easily live their lives. At this time, black people can fully access the rights uh, which is usually guaranteed to citizens, where they can have a decent job, proper treatment for humans, and equality before the laws. Although in the practice they still get a lot of discrimination from white people. And then we come to the last sections of this presentation, which is the conclusion. So in conclusion, the civil rights movement consisted of several spirit movements that became a series of black movements. It became the most successful black movement in history, even though it took decades to achieve its main goal of eliminating racial discrimination, segregation, and inequality against black people in society. The civil rights movement was able to encourage the creations of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 as the embodiment of a legal basis that could guarantee the life of black people to be better life than before. The impacts of the civil rights movement can be felt to this day, until this day, where black people do not need to feel excessively afraid of racial discrimination because they already have the legal basis. Although some practices of racism and discrimination still exist today, black people today can feel their rights as citizens, they which they never have it before. They can own a house anywhere, have a good job, and are equal before the law without fear of discrimination because a clear legal basis is guaranteed to them. So, and then this is the reference that I used to arrange my presentation today. So I think this is the end of my presentation, and I have to say thank you to you for your attention, and thanks for watching. I think this is the end of our my presentation. So I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye. See you.